So, Portrait d'une Femme by Ezra Pound. I'm not going to read the whole thing because my throat is still driving me crazy. But we'll obviously probably end up reading all of it as we go through. First off, Portrait d'une Femme means portrait of a lady in French. So we have a title in French. We had A Station in a Metro was Pound's last piece, right? That's obviously in London. And then this takes place in London, though we start out at the sea. So it's important to remember that even though Pound was an American, he was an expat, so he left America, which hence so much of his work focusing on places outside of America. Now, the piece itself, again, remember, Pound argued that this was an imagist poem, right? And we talked about in the Modernist Manifestos video about In a Station of the Metro is quintessentially an imagist poem. We also discussed how, Pound kind of pushes at his own definitions a lot of the time. So since Pound considered this an imagist piece, we will consider it one, even though I don't think it's the best example of one, and the Station of the Metro is. But there is a lot going on here. We have our major symbols and imagery, right, which we will address as we go through the piece, but we have the sea, very importantly, the Sargasso Sea. We have conversation and this idea of commerce and merchandise, right, of, an exchange of something one way or another, right? So the most important thing to start off with is our Sargasso Sea first line, right? So we have a conceit, right? Remember, which is an extended metaphor that runs throughout an entire piece. And it's very important that you know what the Sargasso Sea is. Otherwise, you lose a lot of the meaning of the poem, even if you don't particularly catch exactly who or what this woman is. The Sargasso Sea is very important. So, our note is that it's a sea in the North Atlantic, excuse me, where boats were becalmed, named for its large masses of floating seaweed. Okay, so what the Sargasso Sea is this patch in the North Atlantic, right, where due to a combination of different water currents, it's a dead patch, essentially, right? So the reason that it's this giant lump of seaweed is that it's just this patch out in the North Atlantic where the tide kind of dissipates and stops, right? It's kind of like a slack tide, nothing happens. It's a dead patch. So, if you are on a boat and, excuse me, if you're just sailing or rowing, you're not going to have any current there. And then whatever floats into it, more importantly, gets stuck there, right? So I would imagine right now it's just filled with like water bottles. But that point is one of the most important points to understand, to grasp a lot of what's going on in the rest of the piece, right? So we start off in the North Atlantic, and then we move right to London, right? So London has swept about you this score years, and bright ships left you this or that in fee, right? So fee, again, we have this concept of commerce and that things cost something, right? Then we have a colon there. So what are these things? Well, for this woman, These things are ideas, old gossip, oddments of all things, strange spars of knowledge and dim wares of price. So we're not dealing with physical items within this exchange, right? Ideas, gossip, oddments of things, and concepts, strange spars and bits of knowledge, right? Um, and this also gets into our second major theme of conversation, right? So 2 and 3, conversation and commerce and an exchange of something one way or another really comes into play here, right? What's the exchange? Well, the exchange is ideas and knowledge, right? Great minds have sought you, lacking someone else. That's an important part. You have been second always. Then we have a question. Tragical, right? You know, is it the tragic that this woman, which by the end I suppose we could put in quotes, um, is always the second hand in conversation, right? No, you preferred it to the usual thing. One dull man, dulling, and uxorious, which means like a submissive husband. One average mind with one thought less each year. Oh, you were patient. I have seen you sit hours where something might have floated up. So we're starting to get an image painted in our mind of this woman that sits around and listens to people talk and gossip, and there's a conversation, there's an exchange of ideas, right? That's what's being traded. Um, but we don't know yet what the purpose of that trade is, right? And then we have floated up, which, is a reference kind of back to things floating up out of the ocean. Hours where something might have floated up. And now you pay one. Yes, you pay richly. So she's giving something back in exchange for these ideas, right? You are a person of some interest. One comes to you and takes strange gain away. So still, we don't know what is being offered back. Trophies fished up. Again, some more sea language. Some curious suggestion. Fact that leads nowhere. And a tale or two, pregnant with mandrakes or with something else that might prove useful, yet never proves. That never fits a corner or shows or find its hour upon the loom of days, the tarnished, gaudy, wonderful old work. The wonderful old work is an important point too, right? Um, what's the work? Well, we know that we're not supposed to consider the speaker in the poem to always be the poet, right? But maybe that's the case here, right? We also have this concept of mandrakes, right, which is an herb used as a cathartic, believed in legend to have human properties, to shriek when pulled from the ground, and to promote pregnancy. The promotion of pregnancy is the important reference here, right? Um, pregnant with mandrakes, right? Pregnant with things that promote growth and ideas, right? And birth, the birth of something in one way or another, yet we're still not sure what that is, right? That might prove useful and yet never proves, that never fits a corner or shows use, or finds its hours upon the looms of day, the tarnished, gaudy, wonderful old work. Again, what is this work? Idols and ambergris and rare inlays, these are your riches, your great store. And yet, for all of this sea hoard of deciduous things, strange woods, half sodden, and new brighter stuff, in the slow float of differing light and deep, no, there is nothing, in the whole and all, nothing that's quite your own, yet this is you. So we have a poem about a woman who, one, is related to the Sargasso Sea in the sense that ideas are brought to her and then they stick with her, right? And she offers something back to whoever is conversing, right? Um, what does she get in return? She gets a sea hoard of deciduous things. Now, this is a very important point to consider. What's something that's deciduous? Well, a deciduous tree is going to shed its leaves, right? It's not going to last forever. If we go back to ideas, old gossip, oddments of all things, strange spars of knowledge, these are things that are fleeting, right? And this is what she is given, and then she offers something. Now, so we have someone that, assumedly, a bunch of writers who can't sit around and talk to their spouses about their ideas, instead go and speak to this woman. Now, in terms of Pound and modernism in general, supposed to be rejecting old ideas and moving forward, here's another example, particularly with Pound, where he's not really doing that. This poem's about a muse, right? Remember the muses in Greek mythology would inspire songwriters and poets and artists, right? They'd give them inspiration. So this is a poem about a muse, but it paints a muse in not a negative light, but a kind of a lonely, almost depressing light, right? She sits around all day and people come and just sit and talk with her for hours, and they offer ideas and gossip and strange bits of knowledge. And what she's giving back isn't directly named in the poem because, in a lot of ways, inspiration is undefinable, right? Where do ideas come from? Um, it's been a question that has annoyed artists ever since they've been giving interviews. They really can't put a pinpoint on anything. Um, you know, different artists have described it differently. Um, you know, Neil Young says that he pulls things out of the ether and he doesn't really understand where they come from. And his family would yell at him for just like sitting on the couch for hours, and he'd be like, "I'm working," and then all of a sudden, right, a song pops in his head, and he can't really place, um, where a line comes from, right? And that's inspiration, and it's undefinable. But to work with the idea of a muse as a tangible, physical woman, as the Greeks did, they're left with nothing, really, right? They're left with a bunch of old ideas that are just stuck there with them. And that's the Sargasso Sea conceit, right? The muse is compared to the Sargasso Sea because things float into her, and then they're just stuck there, right? She has all of these ideas that people have given her, and she's offered inspiration back, but then she's just stuck with all of these thoughts, um, and half completed works, etc. Right? Um, it's interesting that Pound tackled this idea in 1912. I don't know if any of you have ever seen any Kevin Smith movies. Dogma was just re-released. It's great, but there is a Muse character in there who, eventually decides that she's going to stop, you know, giving people all of inspiration and use it for herself and be an artist. But then she gets writer's block, right? So it's like almost, you know, the Muse is a vessel that really can't create on their own, but their sole purpose is to offer inspiration so that others can create, right? Which is a very depressing and, again, kind of lonely concept, which really works well with this Sargasso Sea conceit. Um, so again, in terms of our major symbols and imagery, we obviously have the Sargasso Sea, we have the importance of conversation, but then also that conversation becomes this commerce, this exchange, right? That's really what is being traded, right? Stories and ideas are traded for inspiration, but then we have our muse just stuck with all of the rest of these half concepts. Now, Pound would argue that in terms of this being an imagist poem, that every word is there for a particular reason. But again, that's what all writers do. Um, you know, but in terms of modernism, there's the importance of declarations, right? Of declaring what exactly it is that you are doing and what constraints you will put on yourself and others if they choose to follow your ideas. And then, also the idea that these things are set, right? But can be stretched in one way or another. So, um, this is a great example of a conceit, right? It's important to remember that conceit is an extended metaphor that runs throughout an entire piece, and that would be the Sargasso Sea being the metaphor for our muse, right? Our woman.